Welcome everybody. I'm Kate Meese, Associate Director at the Local Government Commission. This is the third of 15 webinars we will be hosting over 3 years through the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative, which is a partnership between the Local Government Commission, ICLEI, the Institute for Local Government, and the 4 investor-owned utilities. Next slide. The partnership was established in the 2009 CPUC decision. We are working together to help cities and counties reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. So a little bit on the webinar logistics before we get started. Due to the large number of participants, everyone will be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have questions at any time during the webinar, please type them in the question box on the control panel window with the name of the speaker your question is intended for and click the send button. If you're having technical difficulties, write IT in the question box followed by the problem you are experiencing. We'll be trying to answer as many questions as possible through the chat function during the presentations. We will summarize the remaining questions for the speakers during the question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. We'll also be asking the audience questions throughout the webinar. When you see the blue polling window come up, please select an answer and hit the submit button. When most people have selected an answer, we'll share the results with everybody. The presentations from the webinar will be available at lgc.org/seek/webinars. We will also be adding a recording of the webinar once it is available. When the webinar concludes, you will be asked to complete a survey. Please take a few minutes to provide us with input, which will help us improve our future webinars. Today we will have 3 speakers who will be talking about CalGreen and utility codes and standards programs. With us today we have Jane Taylor, who is a senior architect for the California Building Standards Commission. She will be talking about the requirements under CalGreen for commercial buildings. Jane leads their technical team to support the Commission in its adoption of building codes and standards for the state. She has worked with staff and other state agencies in the development and adoption of CalGreen. We'll also have Javier Mariscal, a project manager for Southern California Edison. He will be talking about statewide codes and standards REACH code program. Javier represents Southern California Edison for the statewide codes and standards program, which includes the 4 investor-owned utilities. The codes and standards program implementation activities are driven by the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission Energy Division Policies and Priorities. And lastly, we have Wes Solons from StopWaste.org, who will be talking about differences between rating and certification systems and the costs associated with those. Wes Solons is a program manager with Stop Waste. Wes managed a green building program in the San Diego area, co-wrote the multifamily Green Point guidelines and rating system, consulted on over 40 green building projects, and helped develop the Green Point rated training curriculum. He supports municipal, commercial, and multifamily green building programs in Alameda County. And with that, I will now turn it over to Jane.
Good afternoon, everybody. Looks like we've got quite an attendee list here today. This is Jane Taylor with the Building Standards Commission. Thank you all for joining, and thank Kate for a nice introduction. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a rather boring slide. It just has my name on it, but I wanted to bring everyone's attention to the number in the lower right-hand corner. I will be referring to the numbers of the slides. That will help the people change slides and also direct your attention to it. I'm not in control of the slides here, so that's the way we're going to handle that. So could we go to slide number 2, please? Okay, what we're going to talk about today is why we have a CalGreen code in California, how it was developed, and some of the provisions that are in it with a emphasis on the mandatory ones and also those that concentrate on non-renewable energy savings. Before we get to that, I wanted to ask one of the polling questions, and that just has to do with our attendee list. We have quite a few attendees here, and we wanted to find out who you are. So if we could have the first polling question, which is, who are you? And if you could select one, building official, building inspector, plan checker, administrative finance, other, that assumes you're either not in the local jurisdiction, organization, or you're something else. I guess the technology won't allow you to fill that in what you are, but at least it will help us know who we've got with us, and thank you for answering that. Okay, thank you for that. If we could move to the next slide, please, number 3. Here we have some facts and some goals that why we have the CalGreen Code. We show a little pie chart, building energy, California greenhouse energy emissions. We know that buildings are pretty significant emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, Governor Schwarzenegger ordered, through an executive order, a reduction in electricity use by state buildings and associated greenhouse gas emissions. And then we signed into law AB 32, as we all know, which recently was challenged in the latest election and survived the threat. So those are some ways that the state has responded. And if we could have the next slide, please. This just shows a couple more pies here. This is energy use by industry on the right, and then how it's broken down among buildings in the pie chart in the center. It's been estimated by the Air Resources Board that 3 million metric tons of CO2 will actually be saved by our green building code. So that's the good news. Could we have slide number 5? This one doesn't have a number on it only because we covered it with some graphics. It's number 5. It talks about water use in California. A governor issued the 2009 proclamation requesting that people save 20% of water use in California. Always a sensitive issue because we're drought prone. But water also has energy significance as well in the treatment and conveyance of water. And another reason to save water in California is to reduce the energy. You can also see this really has nothing to do so much with energy, but on the pie chart it shows that 12% of energy actually is used by leaks in California. So if we can fix that loophole, that would go a long way to saving some water here. Slide number 6, please. When we in 2007, in addition to those other things that the governor did, he, in legislative veto messages, he directed CBSC to develop green building standards for 2010. With that in mind, we moved forward, Building Standards Commission. We enjoined the Department of Housing and Community Development for residential, the Division of State Architect for public schools, and the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development also stepped forward with some desire to do voluntary standards for hospitals in California. Slide number 7, please. And this, who we are, with the authority to do this, we're an independent commission that adopts building standards for California. We are a little arm, a tiny arm of the State and Consumer Services Agency. Next. I won't go through every one of these, but these are, the chair of the commission is the secretary of the State and Consumer Services Agency, is a cabinet member, or she is a cabinet member of the governor. We have 10 commissioners, as you can see, from a variety of building backgrounds. Next. CBSC responsibilities, again, the important ones probably are to develop building standards for occupancies where no other state has the authority, for non-residential, HCD being residential. And SB 1473 a couple of years ago gave the Building Standards Commission authority for green building standards where no agency has authority. Another reason to go ahead and develop the CalGreen Code. We adopt and approve building standards for publication. And then another important thing that we do is we act as the state depository for local government modifications. and that's what we'll be expecting from our local governments as the 2010 codes roll out. Slide number 10, please. This is the an array of the building codes. You're familiar with all of them. Part 6, people refer to Title 24. It's actually just a part of the whole Title 24. Part 11, the newest member of the family. We started in 2008 with the voluntary code, and we're moving forward with it. Next, please. When we moved ahead in developing Part 11, in 2007, we formed a green building focus group, we called it. It's not really an advertising or marketing focus group. It's more like a workshop, but it's made up of these types of individuals. We started it in 2007 when we considered the voluntary code, and we still have it. It's changed a little bit as far as membership is concerned, but we still maintain it. Matter of fact, it's going to meet next week when we talk about clarification, cleanup, modifications to the 2010 version of the CalGreen Code. I believe Wes Sullins, who's a participant today, a panelist, is also going to be at that meeting. So you can see we have quite a variety of people that are interested in that code. Next. This slide, number 12, shows who the contributing state agencies were beyond those three or four that actually adopted the code. We used all of their expertise, and the Energy Commission, the last one here on the list, actually helped us draft some of the technical language for the energy provisions in the code. Next, please. We also looked at some of the other green building points programs and other things that were out at the time in 2007 when we started this. These are the ones that we included in looking at. The ASHRAE Standard 189 was a draft at the time proposed, and now it's a full-blown standard, 189.1. In addition, there's proposed for 2012 is the International Green Construction Code by the International Code Council. The International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials also has Plumbing and Mechanical Green Supplement. So there's quite a few codes out there now that may change our code a little bit as we move forward, but this is basically what we use to develop what we have in place right now. Slide number 14, please. What we do when we adopt a code in California, we are bound by law to follow some of the provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs regulatory process in California. It requires a public comment period. It requires that public hearings be held if requested. And then in the case of building standards, we actually hold a commission meeting, which is not where they're adopted, and additional public comments can be taken. We actually have at least 2 meeting opportunities where people can attend, making building standard adoption even more transparent than regulatory adoption in California. Number 15, please. This is the development of the California Green Building Standards Code. We had initial voluntary standards in the 2008 code. Some cities and counties actually adopted some of those provisions. And then for the 2010 code, which goes into effect in less than a month now, we have mandatory standards that everyone statewide has to implement. And then we also have voluntary standards that can be adopted or can be used voluntarily. And then our next adoption cycle, the CalGreen Code doesn't even go into effect until January 1, 2011. So we thought, well, let's give people a chance to use it for a while before we start really tinkering with it. So we're going to do a little cleanup supplementary cycle to it. We've already got a draft proposed for that focus group we talked about. The next cycle starts on 12/31, and it will culminate in a supplement to all of the parts, well, whatever they're being amended, the codes effective July 1, 2012. Slide number 16, please. Now, talking about what's in CalGreen, it's laid out very similarly to other parts of Title 24. It starts off with an administrative chapter that scopes the provisions in the code to new construction, That's to ease people in. We're not going to try and do too much at the beginning. We do talk about local amendments. I believe it was AB 210 that clarified that green building standards are building standards, and if amended, should be included under those filings. So we have a little discussion of that. And then it talks about the different state agency authorities and how the code is applied to residential, to non-residential, to public schools, and to hospitals. Next. We do have matrix tables. I don't know why we have this here where it is, but there's this is kind of how to use the code more than anything. There's one at the beginning of each chapter, similar to the building code, to indicate what state agency adopts which section or which chapter in the code. Chapter 2 definitions, again, similar to other codes. There's definitions up front that are used multiple times in the code, and then those that are only used in one chapter are at the beginning of that chapter. The banners you can see, BSC, HCD, those are defined in the front of the code, and they're used wherever there's a little difference between what agency adopts what. Slide 18, please. Chapter 3 is kind of an important chapter. It's a short one. It talks about the scope of the code. It talks about how it should be used for mixed occupancy buildings. For example, if you have a mixed occupancy where you have retail below, say, and residential above, you'd be using both chapters 4 and 5, residential, non-residential, for the code. Talks about phase projects and how shell buildings and tenant improvements fit into the code. And then it has an introduction to the voluntary tiers or REACH standards. And each of the agencies has some REACH standards for residential, non-residential, and for hospitals. And DSA for public schools does something a little bit different. Next, please. Then we start in with the technical, I guess you'd say, would be the Chapter 4 residential mandatory measures. That's HCD's chapter. And then Chapter 5, that's shared between Division of State Architect and with most of the provisions adopted by the Building Standards Commission for commercial buildings. Obviously, Kate mentioned we're not talking about residential today. Chapter 6 is like some of the other, Chapter 35 of the Building Code talks about reference standards. Chapter 7, we have an installer and special inspection qualifications section, so people can be introduced on how they can enforce and use the code. And then we have something a little different here in this code, and I believe we'll move these compliance forms and worksheets into our guide in the next edition. But we have these in here, sample forms, and how you can comply with some of the provisions of the code. Slide 20, please. Checklists. We have checklists that show what is voluntary and what is mandatory for each section of the code by agency, and they're actually located in after the voluntary chapter. So HCD's checklist, for example, goes at the end of Chapter A4. Ours, DSA's, OSHPA's go at the end of Chapter A5. Significant in the voluntary chapters, those are the A4 and the A5. There's a whole host of provisions that can be adopted by local jurisdictions, including the tiers and the concomitant electives that go with them. Same for non-residential. OSHPA does something a little bit different. They reference a different type of tier structure, but and of course they wouldn't be adopted by the local jurisdictions. So those are important because those contain the REACH standards that local jurisdictions might want to adopt. Slide 21, please. So for non-residential, here's our mandatory measures. We have planning and design, energy efficiency. You probably recognize these. They're kind of how the points programs out there are broken down. We didn't really want to change that because everyone's kind of familiar with that. Slide 22, please. So in the first chapter, Chapter 5, Division 5.1, we have all of our site issues here. And here we have site development. We talk about stormwater pollution prevention plan. Actually, we're modifying this even by errata to clarify it. We really aren't requiring a full blown-out SWIPS analysis for every project, but all new projects less than 1 acre at least have to have some kind of stormwater pollution prevention. And the same is true of residential. And next, please. We're requiring that new projects include bicycle parking, and that's mainly for people who are working in these office buildings so that they can ride to work. This one and the next couple of slides, can you move forward, please? Next slide. This just shows where the bike lockers could be close to the entrance and where the bike racks for the visitors could go. Next, please. And then the next one, which is designated parking for clean air vehicles. This is one that we include along with the bicycle parking to assist with getting people, if not out of their cars, into fuel-efficient cars, into vans, into other things that help with that transportation element of reducing greenhouse gases. Next, please. This shows where you could possibly locate your clean air vehicles, but they don't even have to all be together. They could be scattered around. You can use compact spaces for some of them, and you might designate some as van pools. So there's different ways to do it, and it's kind of up to the locals to decide how they want to do it. Next. Mandatory is also a provision for light pollution reduction. This is also shared by the Division of State Architect. Whenever you see that little parenthetical expression there, that means that they've also adopted that for public schools. But this we're basically referencing the California Energy Code provisions for energy efficiency of outdoor and building lighting. And we're referring to that so that you know what light zone you're in and how efficient your fixtures must be and the cutoff fixtures. We've got a couple of other provisions in there. We make some exceptions for emergency lighting and security lighting. And the idea here is that at least in meeting the energy code and doing a couple of other things, you've also done double duty and helped to reduce light pollution in our night skies. Next slide, please. The next one in this division is for grading and paving to keep water from entering buildings, and you do that with a little bit of a grading plan to show how you're diverting it away. The idea here is to increase the longevity of your building and keep it from harm. Next, please. Then we go into Division 5.2, which are the mandatory measures having to do with energy efficiency. The only thing we really have in there, and this is with working with the Energy Commission, is that we're making a reference to Part 6, the Energy Code, and DSA shares that. OSHPD is exempt from the Energy Code, so they do not get involved with that. We have no mandatory energy standards in our CalGreen Code. We defer that to the Energy Commission. Next, please. So we go to Division 5.3, which has to do with water efficiency and conservation. We have, for indoor potable water use, we have separate water meters. Actually, these are sub-meters for high water use building users. And the idea here is to allow the users of the water and the landlords to see, to monitor their water use. It's not intended for billing purposes, but and it's not anything that would be installed necessarily by the utility, but it's a sub-metering system that shows you how much water you use, and that itself is an incentive to save water. Next. In response to the governor's proclamation in 2009 about the 20% water reduction, we are mandating that we now save 20% of potable water inside the building. This can be done through a series of a couple of ways. One, prescriptively through fixtures, each one of which saves 20%, and I believe you could probably get there depending on what those are. Or you can have a performance standard that allows you to kind of play with the numbers maybe use waterless urinals, or if you have recycled water available for your building, that would be a big help. And there's different ways to get there. We have the water use worksheets in the back that you can figure out what your baseline is and then how to comply to get to the 20% reduction. Next, please. For outdoor potable water use, currently the Department of Water Resources has their model efficient water landscape or model water efficient landscape ordinance, their MWELO. And we're basically just raising the threshold for that so that we're going to require now that instead of 5,000 square feet of area, that you have to have a separate meter if you have 1,000 square feet of landscaped area. Again, this would be a sub-meter that would be installed by probably by the contractor. The utility would probably not get involved with this. It's not that expensive, and again, it allows you to monitor your water use or find out if you have leaks in the irrigation system. We also require these smart irrigation controllers for landscaped areas over 1,000 square feet, and then the water efficient ordinance would kick in. Now, you may also have a local ordinance in place that is stricter than this. If that was the case, then that one would apply. Next slide, please. This one basically is kind of a trying to attempt to keep water, again, out of the building. This has more to do with, say, not allowing rain and wind-driven rain and things to come in, not so much from drainage and from people tracking it in. And it has, again, to do with encouraging the longevity of the building. Next. Then we move on to Division 5.4, which is Material Conservation Resource Efficiency. The provision in here is for a construction waste management plan. Next, please. And the plan should include a waste reduction of at least 50% of new construction waste, and 100% of excavated soil and land clearing debris. Now, if there's a local ordinance in place, which has been responsive all along and is to that AB 39 that goes way back to 1980 or whatever that was, to encourage local jurisdictions to recycle construction waste. Well, recycle everything, but construction waste as well. And that would supersede this if it's more restrictive. Next slide, please. Okay, let's see. We're still on material resource. This is just a pointer to a law that's in effect that has to do with providing readily accessible places for recyclables. It's through the CalRecycle organization or agency. It has to do with a site collection area, not so much what's inside the building from what I can gather from the ordinance itself. Slide number 37, please. This is a big one for assisting the energy efficiency and reduction of greenhouse gases for the code. It was proposed by the Energy Commission that we make mandatory building commissioning for a certain number of buildings in the state. They apparently are working on regulations for Part 6 along these lines, but in the meantime, they thought it was a good idea that we put it in the Green Code, and since we can't put it in the energy efficiency chapter, we put it in here. They actually drafted the language for it, and the idea here is to maximize the efficiency of building systems at the outset, because then they run more efficiently, they use less energy, and they reduce greenhouse gas emissions. 38. This just kind of helps the slide. It's a very complicated issue. There's experts out there who do nothing but building commissioning, as one knows. There are ways that one could easily probably verify compliance at the local level, which is what we require here. There has to be a commissioning plan. There has to be results of performance tests, and there have to be commissioning report, and all of these things have to be made available to the local jurisdiction for verification of compliance. Knowing that it's complex, over the summer we convened a task force to help draft guidelines for commissioning, and those are now complete. Good news, we have a guide to the non-residential standards of the code now. They're available on our website. Commissioning is included in it, and we've also separated it out as a separate document for those people that are interested in it. Our task force helped to develop some rather simple verification forms that can be used by the building owners and designers, that can be verified fairly simply by the local jurisdictions to make sure that things are complied with. We don't have enough personnel out there that are really experts in commissioning, certified to do this, so we've got to kind of take baby steps, and that's what the intention of this is. And the guideline spells all of that out. Next slide, please. For other buildings, other new buildings, they will be doing testing and adjusting for their new systems and balancing of HVAC systems. This is fairly common even for rather small buildings. As an architect on the outside, I'm familiar with mechanical engineers requiring testing and balancing, always specified in their portion of the specifications. So this is really nothing new to most people. Next. We move on to our last chapter, our division, I guess I should call it. This has to do with environmental quality. It's outdoor and indoor quality. We want to make sure that we cover all of our bases. We start out with fireplaces. This is probably not very common in non-residential new construction, but you might have a ski lodge or a restaurant or something that wants to put a fireplace in. And these are the kinds of appliances that you want to put in, and we show some standards for them. There may be a local air district that has stricter standards that would then supersede these. 41, please. Pollutant control, we have quite a few things in here. This has to do with keeping the mechanical equipment that's installed in the new building clean, basically free of debris, water, and dust as the construction proceeds. And the reason for this, this will actually help also with the efficiency of the system, so you don't clog it to begin with. You start it out working at its maximum efficiency, and that's the purpose behind this one. Next, please. And then we have a series of materials that we talk about for low volatile organic compound emissions. This doesn't have so much to do with energy efficiency, but it does have to do with the air quality in a building and the comfort for the occupants. And so next, please. Again, the same part of this pollutant control, using MERV 8 least filters and controlling, actually pretty much restricting or prohibiting tobacco use. But a local ordinance, again, may supersede this. Next. These basically are just pointers. Again, this indoor moisture control, a longevity and a durability issue for the building, so we reference sections of the building code in here. And then the indoor air quality having to do with ventilation and carbon dioxide monitoring are pointers back to the Energy Commission, local code, Title 8, whatever's more stringent out there. They're basically just reminders to go find those in other places. Slide 45, please. This is somewhat new, however, for at least for non-residential buildings. Again, environmental comfort issue, making it comfortable for the occupants of a building by controlling the entry of noise from outside and also between tenants. And this really has a very narrow scope. If you're near an airport or you're near a freeway or you're near something that's quite noisy, this is where you would use this. And it also, we make an exception for if you're making noise yourself, you really don't have to do this. If you're a factory or something, you probably wouldn't have to do this. Next, please. And then rounding out the mandatory standards, basically we have some pointers here. This, again, outdoor air quality. Now, these have to do with ozone depletion and greenhouse gas reductions through the restricting the type of refrigerants you can use and in your air conditioners, and also the type of things that you can use for fire suppression systems. These are being phased out by the EPA, and I'm not sure what I did some research on halons when we first wrote this. I don't think any of these is being used in new equipment, but there is an inventory out there of them that's used to recharge older equipment. We really shouldn't run into it, but in any event, it's a cautionary, don't use these things. They're not good for our atmosphere. So that concludes the mandatory portion. If we could move on, we'll have a little bit of a talk about what's in the voluntary measures. Non-residential voluntary measures for CBSC for us, commercial buildings, grid neutral, which means for public schools they are trying not to use electricity at schools. They have opportunities to do solar arrays and some other things on campuses that make that possible, so that's a good thing. And then the Office of Statewide Health Planning is taking chunks out of the energy code as voluntaries to encourage hospitals to become energy efficient. Again, they are currently exempt from the energy code. So that's a good thing. Next, please. And then this is just a little discussion. I believe this is in the code and introduction to the appendix. These are not mandatory unless they're adopted by a local jurisdiction. And then the CalGreen Tier 1 and Tier 2, which contain the 15% and 30% energy efficiency increases, are intended for adoption by cities and counties to help meet that net zero energy goal for 2030 that will be discussed by experts. These provisions can also be used voluntarily by designers, builders, and property owners. These are, you'll see that these are our REACH goals. Next, please. This is how it lays out. You exceed the 2008 energy efficiency standards by 15 or 30%, and then we've got a series of voluntary measures that we basically are enhancements from the mandatory portion, or they're from the voluntary section, and these were basically proposed to us for inclusion by the Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission to kind of move the state forward. Now, local jurisdictions can either adopt Tier 1 or Tier 2, or they can kind of mix and match these things. Next, please. In addition, the packages contain 5 additional electives for Tier 1, 15 additional electives for Tier 2. Tier 2 is pretty steep right now, and we probably aren't going to see too many people adopting that. But from any of the electives in the voluntary that aren't covered in the tiers that we showed previously, you can pick what you want. And we have seen some adoptions come through that they're kind of not doing that, but they're doing some other things, which is their authority to do. Then at the very end of the chapter, we have our application checklist. I'll just show you how that works real briefly. Next slide. Here's an example of how it works. This is our mandatory measure for construction waste reduction of at least 50%. And then in the appendix, the voluntary appendix, we have the tiers, the enhanced construction waste reduction of 65 and 80% Tier 1 and Tier 2. Next. This shows the application checklist for Building Standards Commission, and you can see the mandatory boxes are checked. Here's construction waste. The 50% is checked in the mandatory box. The Tier 1 is checked in the Tier 1 box. The Tier 2 is checked over in the Tier 2 box, and then the verification of compliance of either or all 3 is also a mandatory section. So you can see what's checked off and what you need to comply with, and if you want to do tiers, you can go through and see what you need. That's how that is used. Can we have the next, please? Resources. I mentioned briefly we have a guide to the non-residential CalGreen code, which we developed just over the summer. It's found at that particular website, and it has all the provisions in there, how the designers and contractors can comply, and how enforcing agencies can verify that compliance with the code. Department of Housing and Community Development also has a guide for residential. I believe we make a link to their website as well. And also, as I mentioned before, we have the commissioning section pulled out of there as well for people that are especially interested in that. And there's also some links there to some sample commissioning projects just for more information to show how a commissioning package might look. Next, please. We're winding this up, so this is our website, and here's the CalGreen page, which you click on to get there. We have some stuff also on the front page, a link there, so it's easy to find. And slide 55, please. We're basically done, and we will expect your questions. I did want to mention, if you do have additional questions, those kinds that maybe wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning, they can be addressed to cbsc@dgs.ca.gov. If you go to our website, www.bsc.ca.gov, you can find how to ask questions of us, and you may also ask questions about training there. I meant to get in there a couple of polling questions having to do with the tiers. I guess I can let Wes take care of that now that I kind of dropped that ball. We did want to find out how many local jurisdictions, how many of you or how many local jurisdictions are going to be adopting green building amendments for the next codes, for the upcoming codes. And if you could kind of post that question, I'd appreciate that.
Jane, we do have a few extra minutes here. We're a little ahead of schedule, so we have a couple of questions that I'll go ahead and ask you now since we have the time.
Okay.
The first question was, is there a draft of these provisions available for inclusion in a jurisdiction's general plan?
Would they, oh gosh, everything's posted on our website. I don't know if that's in a format that they can use for general plans, but that might be a question we'd have to discuss with them. I'm not sure what they would need. You know, the code itself is available in a PDF. We could provide a Word version of it, but it's not. It's kind of a draft, the Word version. It's not quite the same as the published version. So if that person
can you get that PDF to me, and I can go ahead and put it online for everybody?
How do I do that?
You can just email it. You know, after this, you can email it to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can do that. I'll just do that.
Okay, and then another question was, is it expected that building departments will handle plan and field check for CalGreen commercial?
Yes, it is expected that that will be the case. Our Chapter 7 spells out kind of how that can be done. And just kind of for information, we've been looking at what the City of Los Angeles has proposed for green building adoption. And they're proposing to actually increase permit fees to cover the CalGreen, the additional enforcement of that code. But they are really, really minor. And people are saying, oh no, they're going to just really increase building fees a lot. But it amounts to really not very much per permit. So that may be the case with a local jurisdiction if they decide to do that because of the extra time and effort that we'll take to do the CalGreen code in addition to the other parts of Title 24. But I don't think people should be too afraid of that.
Okay, great. And then it looks like we had another one come in. But our second to last question is, does the CalGreen code apply to building additions as well as new construction?
Currently, it does not. As written for the statewide code, Again, I'm citing some local jurisdictions are amending that code to make it apply to renovations and additions. And we're going to float out also an amendment to the code for the supplement effective July 1, 2012 to do the same for the statewide code. And of course, that will go out to public comment, and we'll see how it flies. But we realize there's a great untapped field there, I guess you'd say, where a lot more energy efficiency and green building could be done with renovations in additions to the buildings.
Okay, and then let's see, the questions keep coming in, so we'll just do, go as long as we can. We'll go to 255 and then go ahead and turn it over. This one says storm runoff from buildings, anything code section that addresses this area. So is there a code section that addresses runoff?
From buildings, there's a voluntary provision that we have for low-impact development, which might cover that. It basically has a reference to a series of mitigation measures you can take. So if stuff's running off your roof, you can capture it in little rain gardens, or you can do cisterns, or you can do some other things to keep the water on site. And I believe that's where you're going with that. The only thing we have in the mandatory for that right now is the stormwater prevention during construction, where we don't want to get sediment and other kind of erosion going on while the construction's going on. But you can find that in the voluntary site section of the code.
Okay. And then we have a comment, lack of revenue and staffing makes it difficult for small rural cities to adopt many of these measures. And the question is, where can we go for help with that?
I guess you'd have to ask us. Again, Building Standards Commission, when it adopts building codes for California generally, it does not have police authority over local jurisdictions. When it comes to the implementation and enforcement of the code, some agencies have that. Department of Housing and Community Development does for housing, for example. But it's not what we do to go out and make sure that everybody's following the codes to the letter, whether it be the building code, the energy code, or now with CalGreen. So recognizing that there is a stretch there, one thing that can be done, of course, it might affect the budget, but one can hire a special inspector for some of these things. Most of the mandatory provisions of our code aren't that difficult, and I think if you go to the guide on our website and you go through that and you see how to comply and how to enforce, if you have any specific questions, don't hesitate to contact us. And I should have mentioned as well, we're always available. Our technical staff is available by phone as well, and our contact information is on the website. So if you don't want to email us and wait for us to reply and I wouldn't answer and you want to discuss things with us, we do also have training available that we are doing as well as other people are offering throughout the state. So that might help a little bit.
Okay, and then in regards to minimum versus mandatory measures, this says all local governments are required to adopt the minimum mandatory measures, and Tier 1 and Tier 2 are voluntary, correct? And what is the incentive to adopt Tier 1 or Tier 2?
There is no, yeah, you're correct. That's a good reading. That's, we're starting out with a framework here. I hate to even call it a framework. These are minimum mandatory. They were, vetted through the public and for the building industry, so we're taking baby steps, I guess I should say. The tiers are offered to help the state achieve its goals. There's no points. You don't get a plaque, but you do assist your community and the state in better air quality and better energy efficiency with your buildings if you do adopt those tiers. And that's really all I can say. Some jurisdictions, really want to do that, and others, if they don't care to do that, we've had some adoptions coming in for the 2010 codes where they're just making reference to their adoption of base CalGreen. Whatever you do at the local level is what you can do and what your goals are.
Okay, couple more questions. Does this code adopt or incorporate WELO for residential and or non-residential development?
Do what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the phrase. Does it adopt?
WELO, it's an acronym. I believe it has to do with landscape ordinance.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. We have the outdoor water use and the irrigation controllers, which are basically enhancements of the model water efficient landscape ordinance. So as I mentioned, we've lowered that threshold so that smaller plots and are subject to those types of requirements. Our guide that we have on the website also has sample calculations for your maximum allowable water use and how you can get to the efficiency that you need for your landscape water use that's in the tiers. So yeah, we do have references to that.
Okay, and then the final question is, does CalGreen apply only to buildings, or does it apply to any other structures?
That's kind of a good question. Since things come up.
And then the next question mentioned the same thing. It said, are large new build amusement parks, for example, subject to CalGreen?
You know, there's going to be some odd ones. I know that amusement parks, at least some portions of them, are exempt from the energy code. I'd kind of use that as sort of a guide as to what, but you know, really non-commercial buildings are subject, you know, as far as it's applicable to the CalGreen code, just like any other building code. So if you have some kind of an exemption there for something, like an amusement park, for example, may have difficulty meeting the light pollution reduction, you know, if they operate till midnight and beyond, the way Disneyland does, for example. But they're also exempt from the energy code. So, you know, it may be a case-by-case basis. You'd have to discuss and work with your local jurisdiction, or ask the question of us, and we can do some research in it to see if, you know, really we've got something there that really doesn't seem that the code should apply to it. But generally speaking, it applies like all the other parts of Title 24 to all buildings and structures for, I guess you'd say, for occupancy, for, you know, that people inhabit.
Great. Well, thank you, Jane, very much. A lot of really good information. And
And
with that, we're going to go ahead and hand it over to Javier. So, Javier, you're up.
Thank you all.
Good afternoon. This is Javier Mariscal, Southern California Edison. And I think I'm going to start with the first polling question, and I'll start reading it as it's going to be loaded up. It goes, let's see, who is the lead staff person responsible for implementing greenhouse gas reduction strategies, including the monitoring and reporting for your city or county? And as you're responding to that, I'll just give you a little background as to who I am. Program manager with the Codes and Standards program at Southern California Edison. Just a little background, Codes and Standards is a statewide program. My counterparts, I have counterparts, I should say, with that are with PG&E and Sempra, which is the Southern California Gas Company, as well as the San Diego Gas and Electric Company. And we're charged with an interesting mandate. We work under the direction of both the California Public Utility Commission as well as the California Energy Commission. And briefly, what we do is assist with energy efficiency measures that could be put into code. That's a very simplistic summary, but it kind of gives you an idea of what we're tasked with. So I'm looking at the responses here. So we've got a very good group here. Okay, well, let's start with the first slide, slide 1. And so I'm going to talk about why energy efficiency matters, giving you some background as to why the utility companies are even involved in this conversation. And it begins with, as Jane mentioned earlier, it also kind of starts with AB 32, which is dealing with greenhouse gas reduction at the statewide level. Part of that is a climate change scoping plan that the California Air Resources Board, CARB for short, they're the master entity, so to speak, in charge of reducing greenhouse gases pursuant to the mandates in AB 32. And so their roadmap, so to speak, is this scoping plan. And what this chart is showing is you can see that natural gas as well as electricity make up a significant part of the total emissions. And if you could reduce natural gas and electricity use, just energy efficiency through energy efficiency, that goes a long way towards meeting the targets that AB 32 has set forth under AB 32 for greenhouse gas reduction. And so you can see why the utilities are a major player in the overall efforts for reducing greenhouse gases in California. Next slide, please. And the reason being is, here are some general rules of thumb. For every kilowatt hour of electricity that's saved, that reduces approximately 1 pound of equivalent carbon dioxide. And you can see the the ratio for natural gas. What's interesting about this, I get asked many times, well, why can't you give me something a little more exact? And the reason why you can't do that, it all depends on what your energy source is. Is it coming from a coal-fired plant, or is it coming from a dam, or is it coming from solar, et cetera? That all affects this calculation. But roughly, on average, for the state, this is a very good rule of thumb. The source is coolcalifornia.org. If you haven't been on that website, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a great source for great information in one place, written in layman's terms. And again, that's a partnership between the California Energy Commission, the California Public Utility Commission, CARB, the Air Resources Board, various universities and nonprofits. So it's a site that I do encourage you to take a look at. Next slide, please. Well, CARB has its scoping plan for the entire state. The California Public Utility Commission has its own roadmap. And within its own roadmap, it has what it's called its big, bold energy efficiency strategies. And it boils down to zero net energy. And I highlighted the first two. For all new residential construction in California, the idea is to be at zero net energy by 2020, and for all non-residential construction by 2030. So that is what we're working towards. Codes and Standards is heavily involved in this initiative. It's demonstrated by the next slide. So what the next slide is showing you is the role that Codes and Standards is playing. And within the quotes, what we're participating in is in the triennial update of Title 24 Part 6. And Title 24 Part 6 is the energy efficiency measures of Title 24. So every 3 years, this particular part of Title 24 gets updated. The Codes and Standards participates by assisting the CEC in what we call case studies, which is code enhancement studies. The idea is coming up with measures that are researched. We look for the technical feasibility of implementing these, et cetera, and we go through the rulemaking process. And the idea is that every 3 years, the energy efficiency measures get more strict. And if you look at this chart, you can see we only have maybe 3 more triennial code cycles before we hit 2020. And in order to accelerate this process of getting to literally a zero net energy building code by 2020 for residential, the whole concept of a REACH code becomes very, very clear, or the need for it. Instead of waiting every 3 years, can we accelerate that? And doing that at a statewide level is difficult. So the next slide, please. This is where the local governments play a very important role in the fact that they have a unique authority to pass ordinances, in this case REACH codes, that require buildings to exceed the minimum energy efficiency standards set by Title 24, Part 6. In other words, instead of waiting for the next cycle, a local government could choose on their own to adopt more strict requirements and not wait until the state does it. So by doing this, again, the local governments can aggressively pursue this goal of achieving zero net energy by 2020. Next slide, please. Now, this process, assuming that a local government wishes to do this and take on this leadership role, the California Energy Commission oversees that process. And they require 3 primary items to be submitted for their review. The first, obviously, is the text of the proposed REACH code ordinance. And within that, there should be a statement that all buildings covered by the ordinance shall not use any more energy than permitted by Title 24 Building Energy Efficiency Standards. That's kind of a given. But the third item, the idea of a cost-effectiveness study with a supporting analysis showing how that particular local government determined that by adopting these REACH code energy saving measures, that in fact that they are cost-effective. Now that's in the eye of the beholder almost, because the CEC is not particularly looking at the technical merits of the program or the methodology or the assumptions. What they really are looking for is the fact that you did it, that the local government in fact did this study and on their own determined that in fact it was cost-effective. So again, the CEC is not reviewing your cost-effectiveness study on technical merits, etc. I mean, they will identify some major egregious omissions or something, but what they're really looking for is to make sure that you, the local jurisdiction, in fact went through this exercise and made a determination that these measures are cost-effective, and that, of course, would be included within the REACH code ordinance itself. The other important point here is that the CEC process, the application and review process, is required in order for a REACH code to be legally enforceable. There's probably at least 90 to 100, I would call green building ordinances that include a measure or that requires exceeding Title 24 by 15% or more in order for you to pull a permit, but did not go, many of these unfortunately did not go through this process of the CEC reviewing the cost-effectiveness study. So our understanding is that without that, these jurisdictions run the risk of being legally challenged by a developer or builder or a homeowner pulling a permit, and if they were to ask, well, did you get the CEC to review your cost-effectiveness study? If the answer is no, then they can probably challenge you. So with that said, this is why the utilities are being involved or involved in this REACH code program. Next slide, please. The process that we're talking about, and this is where the utilities have decided to provide some technical assistance to local jurisdictions who want to go through the CEC review process. And so working together with staff, again, the Codes and Standards team working with CEC staff, we came up with this, this adoption process checklist. And the first is, you want to go out and conduct public workshops on the draft REACH code proposal. Following that, I mean, the idea behind this, of course, is to educate folks as to what is this, what is the purpose, why are we doing this, to talk to the home builders, the local contractors, et cetera. And this is the opportunity to answer a lot of questions, make sure everyone's on the same page as to why, what are the benefits. You start talking about the cost effectiveness of this particular initiative in that particular community, et cetera. Following that public input, which is probably the most important aspect, is a first reading of the ordinance. That's a public hearing. That's before the City Council or the County Board of Supervisors, depending if you're a county or local city. The third is following that ordinance reading, assuming that it got approved, the application is submitted, an application I should say, is submitted to the California Energy Commission, where they'll review the cost effectiveness study, they'll review the text of the ordinance, et cetera. And again, as I'm saying, they're just making sure that you did it. Now, following their review and approval, then the city or county would then do their second reading of the ordinance in a public hearing. And after that, then it gets filed with the Building Standards Commission. So again, that's a very high-level review, or I should say a high-level checklist of the process for adopting a REACH code. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the background. So what are the utilities through the Codes and Standards program? What are we doing to assist local jurisdictions when it comes to adopting a REACH code? Well, probably the most important service that we're providing is the fact, is providing the cost effectiveness study. And what the Codes and Standards team has done is prepare for all the climate zones. The state of California is broken into 16 climate zones. So for each climate zone, we went ahead and prepared a cost effectiveness study. And we did this for both residential and non-residential prototypical building types. So we had a small single-family house, a large single-family house. We had a low-rise multifamily apartment building, high-rise multifamily apartments, low-rise office building, and a high-rise office building. And within the chart, you can, you get an idea of the square footage, and we held these prototypical building types. We conducted the cost effectiveness study again for all the climate zones using these same building types. And what we found, what I'll do is over the next couple of slides, I'll briefly talk about the methodology and assumptions that were used. So next slide, please. Okay, so in this case, what we did is for each building type, they were designed with what we call the realistic set of energy measures, just to meet the 2008 Title 24 standards. So this is just, again, to comply with code. Then that was followed with upgrading the building with different combinations of energy measures that would have you exceed base code by at least 15%. And even though you really can't see it in the slide, what we did was we looked at the incremental costs at a minimum, at a maximum, and then we averaged that out for each of the measures that were introduced. And so that methodology was used again for all 6 prototypical building types. Next slide, please. Following that, we then went ahead and conducted a very simple payback analysis. And in essence, all we did was we divided the incremental costs for exceeding base standard by the estimated annual energy cost savings. So we used about 16 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity and 94 cents per therm for natural gas. We didn't assume any inflation. Again, a very conservative approach. And what we found out, and again, we averaged out the payback depending on how many options we did. For example, for single-family homes, we did 2 options. For a small single-family home, I should say, and came up with an average. For high-rise multifamily apartments, there were 3 options, and we averaged that out. And so you kind of get the gist. And again, of course, this would change according to what climate zone you were in because of the measures that would be required given the local climatic conditions. So next slide, please. Here's an example using Climate Zone 6 when it comes to the payback. Again, Climate Zone 6, it's a very mild coastal climate. And I don't want to go too much into the numbers, but in essence, for you to appreciate the range, to exceed base code for single-family homes, small single-family houses, I should say, it ranged from 54 cents to 88 cents a square foot. And remember, we did, I believe for this, two different options. I think for the multifamily buildings, we did 3 options, and you can see it ranged from $1.06 to $1.30. The range is a little higher when you get to the high-rise residential. That goes from 76 cents to $1.25. And so when you average all this, all 3 of these building types for residential, we came up with 87 cents a square foot. Again, when you average the payback, et cetera, it came out to about 30 years, which technically is within the life of these particular building types. So that's considered cost effective. Now in the real world, obviously, you would probably want to do a much more detailed life cycle analysis. You may want to take into account inflation of energy costs, et cetera. But again, this is a very simple payback analysis. It was a methodology that we vetted through the CEC staff, et cetera. So as far as CEC staff is concerned, this is within the parameters that they're looking for when it comes to conducting a cost effectiveness study. Next slide, please. So here's an example for the non-residential payback example. I think what I'll do is I'll skip right down to the simple payback average. It came out to 6.5 years, which is dramatically much shorter than for the residential. And there's a lot of reasons for it. But in this case, you begin to appreciate that by doing this analysis, there's very good information here that, again, we vetted the methodology and assumptions with CEC staff. And so it definitely meets the requirements of conducting a cost effectiveness study as far as CEC staff is concerned. Next slide, please. So that is an overview of the cost effectiveness study. Before I get into the ordinance language, I do want to say that these cost effectiveness studies are available by climate zone. And what we are doing is making this available to any jurisdiction that's interested in adopting a REACH code for free. The idea is to save local jurisdictions the time and money that it would cost individual jurisdictions to do this if they had to do it on their own. The idea also is to provide consistency and avoid duplication of efforts. And so, again, it's our hope that local jurisdictions who are interested in pursuing a REACH code would take advantage of these climate zones. For example, going back these cost effectiveness studies. For example, the cost effectiveness study that was done for Climate Zone 6, within that climate zone, there's 80 jurisdictions. If any of the 80 jurisdictions decided to use that cost effectiveness study, say 4 or 5 or even 10, they could use the same one. And the CEC staff actually would prefer that everyone use the same study, realizing that the ordinance may be different. So that I'll segue into the ordinance language aspect now. Our Codes and Standards is also, in addition to the study, we're providing a model template with language, findings, etc., that we've put together that, again, becomes the framework for putting together a REACH code ordinance. It is performance-based versus prescriptive. In this case, in very blunt terms, it says exceed, Title 24, Part 6 by 15%. Doesn't really say how to do that. So it's relying more on the individual owner, building owner, the applicant, et cetera, to come up with their unique solution for their particular site, for their particular set of circumstances. So the reason why we prefer this is for the following reasons: to maximize the flexibility for designers and builders, the ability to customize energy measures pursuant to individual project circumstances, again, to promote creative design solutions and encourage the application of emerging technology. So that's the thought behind that. Next slide, please. So going back to the overall process, again, I mentioned that public meetings, especially the public workshops up front, is very important to get input, to address concerns head on at the very beginning. We, the Codes and Standards team, are also providing technical assistance in helping local jurisdictions facilitate these workshops and provide technical information regarding, say, the cost-effectiveness study, the assumptions, methodology that were used. Again, being there to make sure that people have the facts before them to kind of dispel any myths that may be out there, etc. So again, we are available to provide and facilitate these types of workshops. We're also available to attend public hearings to answer technical questions from elected officials or members of the public. And when I say we, the Codes and Standards team, we obviously would bring in subject matter experts that we feel are qualified to provide this level of expertise and to answer the types of questions that we could anticipate coming up at these public meetings. And again, the idea is to do this and provide this service as a service and not charge for that. The next slide, please. So as of today, there's 17 local jurisdictions that have gone through this process, what we call the CEC approval process, for the 2008 Title 24 standards. Several years ago, there were at least more than a dozen, maybe not, I don't know if it was 2 dozen jurisdictions who did something similar based on the 2005 standards. But in this case, just again, thinking back just over the last 10 months or so, 17 jurisdictions. My understanding, there's probably at least 4 to 5 other jurisdictions that are in the pipeline, so to speak, to have their REACH code approved by the CEC within the next several months. And so that number is expected to climb to at least 24, 25 very shortly, at least within the first quarter of next year. And again, I think it bears repeating that only those local ordinances that have been approved by the CEC are legally enforceable. And with that, next slide, please. I'm going to open this up to questions. But before I do that, I'd like to do the second polling question. And it goes, does your jurisdiction provide incentives to encourage owners and tenants to exceed Title 24? And if so, what types of incentives?
And Javier, while folks are answering that question, there are a couple there's a question that came in and a comment on that that you may want to also address. The question was, is there any statewide effort to mandate efficiency improvements in the existing building stock triggered by some event like time of sale or major remodel? And there's a comment which it looks like was from somebody at PG&E that there are jurisdictions working on residential energy conservation ordinances or commercial energy conservation ordinances. And this person mentioned that the utilities would like to work with the, with the leaders to help develop some best practices and models. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I'll start with the first question, whether or not REACH codes are triggered by a time of sale. That is something that is being looked at, and but is not something that is being actively promoted right now, but it is something that we are looking into. As far as remodels, the REACH code does, in some cases, I believe the city of Goleta, for example, if you're doing a remodel for residential and it's 500 square feet or more, it triggers in the REACH code. But again, the point that I want to make is the REACH code is definitely something that each local jurisdiction can modify to meet their local political climate. You know, if they want to take smaller steps or if they want to be very aggressive, they can choose the trigger points. They can choose whether or not it only applies to new construction or existing homes, you know, and it gets triggered when you want to do a remodel, et cetera. So that kind of deliberation typically gets done in the public workshop period, and it's very important to talk about what triggers the REACH code. I think the second question was on the, I guess, the RICO, I think is what you mentioned, Kate.
Right.
They're looking for best practices and models. You know, this is very exciting, and we are looking for those cities that are considering to do this. We'd like to partner with you if we could, and so I think that I'm pretty sure I know who wrote that. But and thanks for bringing it up. It definitely is something that codes and standards is on a more global basis, is constantly looking for those cities, those jurisdictions, I should say, that are kind of pushing the envelope, coming up with some innovative ideas. We'd like to hear from you and see if we can't model something that maybe could be replicable across the state, and maybe we can bring on some additional resources to help you as well as your fellow local jurisdictions. Again, remember, we're trying to meet this mandate of coming up with a Title 24 zero net energy code by 2020 for residential.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all of our questions, and that brings us to Wes. So you're on.
Thank you all.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending and sticking with us through the webinar here. Hopefully it's been useful. I'm going to cover kind of some ideas on policy around green building and how it fits with CalGreen, and then cost, because that's always the question that comes up. So let's get to it. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of who we are. We're called StopWaste.org, but we're actually a joint powers authority of Alameda County. So we are a local government agency. We consist of the cities and the county and the two sanitary districts as well. And we support waste reduction recycling throughout the county and beyond. One such case is our green building program that I am part of. And we give grants, technical assistance, training opportunities, sponsorships, et cetera, to green building projects in the county, and also help with adopting green building policies in our cities and county. And I guess the thing I wanted to mention there, too, was our agency has been kind of involved with green building since pretty much early in the beginning, 2001. And we actually wrote the guidelines that were incubated in-house here, and they're now part of Greenpoint Rated at Build It Green. So we've been working with them and with the LEED standards for a long time. Next, please. So my quick overview of today is talk about a little bit about when green is code, as kind of Jane covered. It seems to be the place where green building is going, is being come up to code. And then talk about REACH standards, not just on the energy side, but also in green practices, costs, some recommendations, and then some resources. Next, please. So again, just kind of repeating what Jane said, the IGCC just came out with a version of the International Green Construction Code that's really, I guess, foundational in the sense from a national and international level that green building is becoming part of the national kind of international vernacular. So that's just an interesting development. It's heartening to see, and we're all on board with it. Next, please. And that being said, I wanted to show this slide that I take this from LEED's, one of their presentations, but the idea here is to show that how green building, as it becomes part of code, will continue to sort of raise the floor on how buildings are constructed in terms of energy and water and other resource use, but that there's still a place for the leadership standards, the kind of rating systems and other programs that go above and beyond code. So you'll see here just sort of a timeline of, a relative timeline that shows how codes, as in CalGreen, as in international IGCC, they will be progressing and getting more strict over time, likely, and that the rating systems will track that and still provide sort of a meaningful label for above code practice. Next. So here we'll talk about REACH standards. And I guess before we go to the next slide, I'll put up my poll question, which is how many of your jurisdictions have a green building code currently on the books? And this would be before, I guess, before January 1st, because going back to Jane's question about how many are adopting a tier, that that would be something as of January 1st would be enacted, I think. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so got about a quarter. All right. So that same question, the one of how many codes are out there, how many green building standards are in place, is something that the Bay Area Climate Collaborative looked at. And I'm a member of their Green Building Working Group, so I worked on this with them. They are a public-private partnership launched by the San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland mayors, and they're committed to supporting regional green building and other kind of climate change reducing strategies in a consistent way around the Bay Area. And one of the things we first identified as an area of need was identifying what are the green building standards being used in the Bay Area. Because there was sort of a general knowledge that there's a wide range of green building requirements at the various cities and counties, but and there's been many efforts to try to map all those, but this was kind of a more concerted effort to get it all done as robust as we could and come up with some summary. So we produced a map and some statistical, I guess it's an Excel spreadsheet that lists all of the cities in the county and the requirements. And that's downloadable from their website. And the next slide shows kind of the results of that in table form. So what we found was that it's not as different as we had thought. There's 44 of 109 of the jurisdictions require some form of LEED for new commercial, and nearly half require Greenpoint rated. And there were only a few outliers. I think there was 1 or 2 LEED for homes, and I don't think there were any Green Globes standards being referenced. And you can see the kind of detail down at the bottom there. But again, I encourage you to go to their website and download the full report, and I'll give the website later. Next, please. So I'll talk about LEED as a leadership standard. As most of you know, LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. They are administered by the U.S. Green Building Council. Certification now is done by a sister company called the Green Building Certification Institute. There has been kind of in recent years, a separation of the person, the entity that creates the standard and the one that certifies it. So there's some efficiencies there as well as some, not as much, you could say, influence on one or the other. Next. So LEED targets all the building types for the commercial sector and homes. You've got homes at the top, neighborhood developments, various commercial sector projects like interiors, core and shell, and then schools, healthcare, et cetera, retail. They also have an existing buildings rating system, which is more about kind of process than like ongoing green certification. There are aspects of it that deal with energy efficiency and water efficiency, but a lot of it is about kind of maintenance policies and how you operate the building. And then if you click once, I got some highlights here. There we go. So this is where the overlap with CalGreen is. On homes, there's the residential portion of CalGreen, which we won't cover today, has some overlap there, as well as the new construction and core and shell and LEED. So this is the portion when I talk about LEED and costs and things a little while, I'm talking specifically about the new construction and or core and shell if it's applicable. Next. So another leadership standard that we're seeing is the CalGreen tiers being used. And those are the ones that, again, Jane covered as the voluntary amendments that can be amended and adopted by local jurisdictions. And they have requirements, as she showed, in Tier 1 is a 15% bump in energy efficiency, Tier 2 is 30%. Then there's the prerequisites above that and a menu of additional options. Local jurisdictions, as was stated, must file findings to adopt the tier. They also need to file it to the Energy Commission, again, as was stated by Javier. And the piece that I wanted to mention is that jurisdictions can modify the tiers as desired when adopting. And that's a part that's a bit concerning for jurisdictions that have green building policies already in place, or for the practitioners that have gotten used to LEED or other standards and are kind of up to speed on those rating systems, or have spent the time to invest in educating themselves and getting the resources. Next, please. So with that, I'll just cover a couple of concerns about the tiers as a REACH code. The tiers are still a work in progress. They haven't been defined exactly yet. There are some training opportunities, but the in-depth kind of on the ground, once it's implemented training obviously hasn't happened yet, because we're still sort of in this ramp up and then kind of waiting to see how it goes once it's started phase. Could lead to inconsistent implementation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I do know that the guidance documents are going to be released very soon by BSC and HCD, so that my first comment there about definition, that kind of portion will be eliminated. We'll at least have a very specific requirements on what are in the tiers. Because right now what you see on the tier is a checklist with the measures and doesn't have the same amount of documentation and rigor behind what's exactly required. So we're waiting for those documents. And then the other piece is that many of the tiers and mandatory measures, for that matter, are beyond the typical scope of local building departments. So unless you've had a green building ordinance in place for a while, a lot of this is new. Reviewing construction waste demolition ordinances at the building department is not something that's typically been done, nor is looking at VOC content of paints or formaldehyde in wood. Those are all things that are going to have to be taught and educated just on the mandatory portion before the tiers are even adopted. So I think there's definitely an education component there. And then the third bullet, tiers can be adopted piecemeal. Again, this goes to the inconsistent and maybe confusion from the builder or designer community, looking at what do I need to meet the various green building ordinances around the county, around the state, et cetera. And then really, if you're working on LEED project, probably the biggest barrier at this point is duplicative documentation, because a lot of the LEED measures are very similar to CalGreen but have small little differences. And that small difference may make the need to create a whole new set of submittals to satisfy CalGreen that wouldn't already satisfy LEED. And that's something that our agency is taking on to kind of help with and fill that gap by providing what we're calling a companion guide to the Building Standards Guide to CalGreen that lists exactly how you can use your LEED submittals and modify them as such to be consistent with CalGreen, and also from the building inspector side, what to look for in the LEED submittals so that they meet CalGreen. So that's something, again, I'll show a place to download some resources, but that one's going to be available before the January 1st. We're still working on it. Next slide. So a little comparison of the tiers in LEED versus LEED. So green building, on the other hand, offers regional consistency. It's specifically with LEED, this is a national standard. They have a pretty robust training program, although you have to pay quite a bit for some of them. There are rigorous third-party verification of the projects that go through, and it's a consistent process to verify. There are some very specific rules on who can be a reviewer for LEED projects and how you can appeal things and that sort of thing. So unlike a city or local jurisdiction who can have some leeway, LEED is very cut and precise on how you can verify certain things. And then the requirements in LEED have evolved over a long time, 13 years. So measures that were either too strict or not strict enough or didn't fit all building types have been defined and ironed out. And so the tiers, while they've kind of made use of a lot of that knowledge, haven't had the same ground testing yet. And then LEED as well as Greenpoint Rated are offering things that result in benchmarking and tracking of projects. And we're not quite there yet with LEED, but you'll be able to tie emissions reductions from LEED buildings back to your climate action plans and start to track and benchmark buildings in local jurisdictions. So I think that level of reporting and tracking is something that kind of sets the third-party systems above CalGreen in some ways. Now, on the other hand, to be fair, CalGreen has a lot of strengths too. I mean, the mandatory measures are a solid foundation, and probably even more interesting or kind of compatible on the tier side is that they can be incorporated into existing permitting process. So that is very attractive from a local level when looking at enforcing a green building standard, rather than relying on an outside third party to, you don't really know how they're setting standards or saying yes or no to various measures and reviewing LEED projects. It can all be done kind of in-house through existing processes. So that's definitely a selling point I see for CalGreen. And then again, jurisdictions can say, well, we really care about renewables and energy efficiency here, but are not quite as interested in light pollution, so we can modify it in those ways. So that's the strength of CalGreen. And then the one that's often cited is there's cost savings for doing a tier instead of LEED because you don't have the same costs for hiring consultants and such as LEED. And that's the one I'm going to tackle next, the next cost. Next slide. So just a quick slide on some of the costs of LEED certification. There's hard costs, soft costs, and I kind of combine them all here. But what you see are from an applicant or owner standpoint doing a LEED project, you've got your basic registration and certification fees. You've got building commissioning, which is required in LEED. You've got extra design time for the architects to meet various things, maybe run some extra models for energy efficiency. You've got consultants. Again, maybe you've got additional energy consultants, or you've got a LEED consultant you've hired, or special inspector. You've got upgrades in materials and equipment in some cases. And on a jurisdictional level, you've got the upkeep of what is LEED, what are the latest standards. That's something that has to be tracked, keeping the current LEED standards on file so that applicants can have those is a cost. And then training staff on what are those standards and how to enforce those. And then, of course, the review and verification of projects that they're seeking LEED as some part of your ordinance kind of review or approval process. And then if you click once on the slide, there it goes, fancy. CalGreen, as you'll see here, has a lot of the same costs. So really the only one that's wholly not included is the registration and certification fees. The rest of them are all related to CalGreen in some way. Next slide, please. And there's a CalGreen tier. Sorry, I should make that clear. So we did some analysis on what a typical LEED building costs in Alameda. Again, this is just our climate zone, our area. And the idea was to take a typical project that would trigger a ordinance requirement for a private sector policy. So that would be a medium-sized office building, 20,000 square foot, $8 million. And that really is a size, I think, where LEED makes a lot of sense. If you get below that, some ordinances go down to 3 million or 5 million, and that can make sense to have a LEED requirement. But really, once you get to 5 to 8 million range, the first or upfront kind of embedded costs really can pencil out on LEED projects. So click one more time, please. going to show here how some of the costs stack up to the tier. And this is all hypothetical, but based on our knowledge of LEED buildings and then also of what's included in the tiers, in Tier 1. So the idea here is a basic certified LEED project, not a platinum, not a gold, just the certified building. And you've got the registration certification, but then both LEED and CalGreen require commissioning. There's a few caveats. One in that the LEED commissioning is that's a pretty set number, 25,000. It could be a little more, it could be slightly less, but probably around that much. The CalGreen tier, however, we don't exactly know how it's going to be enforced. So it could be that the commissioning is slightly less than that, but it's hard to say. At this point, we're assuming the Tier 1 CalGreen commissioning, as written, is as stringent as LEED. And that's pretty much how it's written. So next button push, please. So then there's the soft costs. And taking from Javier that same kind of cost-effectiveness study, we applied the factors for our climate zone, 15% above code. There's your first line there, energy efficiency, which is equivalent to CalGreen. And then documentation, there's your lead consultant or your special inspector rater for the CalGreen project on the right. And then additional inspectors or consultants. For LEED, this might be for additional photometric charts or solar renewable energy or something like that, a consultant. On the city side, this might be special inspectors that are required for things outside their scope and review. And the next button push. So the total cost is pretty close, just based on this analysis. And then my note at the bottom is that based on analysis done by CTG, who are consultants that do a lot of energy efficiency work, Tier 1 does not meet the minimum 40 points necessary for LEED certification. That's probably more like 20 to 30 LEED points, depending on tiers measure chosen and equivalency of the standard. So how stringent the commissioning is one of those kind of determinations. Next slide, or next button push, I guess. So there it showed, my last example showed that LEED was slightly higher, but actually, and I don't mean this to say that we encourage lesser energy efficiency in any way, but the basic LEED building is only required to beat code by 10% in California. So if you actually take those same cost-effectiveness studies and apply those numbers, and then click the button one more time, please, you'll see that LEED projects are right in line with, say, a Tier 1 15% above code requirement. I know this is kind of controversial because I'm not, again, saying that 15% above code is too high. It's definitely cost-effective. It makes a lot of sense. And in fact, 15% is the trigger for a lot of utility incentive programs. So projects, as you see at the bottom there, sort of almost by default will go to 15% above code just to make their buildings pencil out better on the energy side. But from a kind of, I guess, a freedom of developers' ability to play within the LEED rating system, it gives them a little more flexibility in terms of finding cost effectiveness, whether it be energy or other measures they can pick. Next slide. So just some conclusions on that are that green buildings are cost effective. Even at the LEED slide I showed, still a 1%, less than 2% cost add. And that's on projects that are accustomed to doing LEED. They haven't, there was a lot of projects in the past that have spent a lot of money to figure out LEED, but really nowadays LEED Silver doesn't cost any more than standard construction when done the right way. So it's not something that's added on late in the game. So green buildings are cost effective even if you go through a certification system. CalGreen is not at zero cost. There are some costs that are consistent. And you need to weigh the pros and cons of self-certification versus third-party. There's, as a jurisdiction, can you increase permit fees, or do you need to have special inspections and staff time to verify, say, CalGreen or LEED? How savvy is your design build community on rating systems that are already out there? Will it be a big change for them to go to a tier if you've already had Green Point rated or something? What are the benefits? Can you quantify them? Can you tie these back to your climate action plans or your policy goals? What is the value of the green label? Is that something that the community values? Maybe they can, get a higher rent or get better leases or something, attract better businesses to downtown if you have a LEED ordinance. And then litigation risk, this one that may be a small possibility that when somebody's saying that they are LEED certified, that carries some arguments about how green the building is or healthy or something, which is kind of on somebody else, I guess, to hold that standard versus CalGreen, where that could be seen as a city requirement or a county. Next, please. So some recommendations on green building REACH policies. Next slide. So the BACC came out with this kind of three-step process, which was first and foremost prioritize education and enforcement of the mandatory provisions in CalGreen. And that's consistent with what I think, with what our agency has come out with, and just makes a lot of sense. There's some good core things in CalGreen that are just so important to get done right. I think that should be the prioritization for everyone. And then where a leadership code is desired, continue to apply Greenpoint rated and LEED as the rating systems of choice. And then should a government adopt a tier, allow third-party ratings as a way to meet the tier requirement. And I added in wholesale because the idea here is there's a lot of duplicative documentation in CalGreen, especially in the tier. And if you now have to have somebody meet a tier plus document LEED and the tier, there's a lot of duplication that's going to happen. So it makes more sense to just make sure the projects meet the mandatory CalGreen if you have a tier requirement, and then allow the rest of the documentation to just be equivalent to the tier. Next, please. And then here's our agency's recommendations on CalGreen, very similar. We add in bay-friendly rated landscapes as a leadership standard because that's something that our agency has kind of incubated here, and see that as a sustainable sites, sustainable landscaping rating system that's out there and is starting to be region-wide and is better practice than, say, the WELO or what have you. And then we also encourage filing findings with the Energy Commission and the Standards Commission as applicable by law. And next. Now again, knowing that the tiers have kind of have some strong points and some attraction, there's a few things that can be done to make the tiers work as a REACH code. And first is to have adequate training of staff, building departments, and planners on verifying the mandatory measures and the tiers. So I think jurisdictions that have had green building ordinances in the past have kind of spent the time, invested up front in understanding green building practices and verified projects, are going to have a leg up and be able to do this much better than ones that haven't yet. And I know Palo Alto is adopting Tier 1, and that makes sense for them because, again, they have a very savvy building department and planning department that have kind of invested the time to exactly spell out the tiers. Same with the City of Livermore. They've done a lot of green building in the past. And then, but know that by doing that, there has to be a clear definition of all the tier requirements for all building types. So there's a lot of questions still about like commercial interiors and what triggers a new construction project at the local level. It's kind of been defined at the state level, but when it gets down to the bottom and down to the cities and the counties, it's going to be different. And yeah, the file findings, my last bullet there. I just heard that the Building Standards Commission is going to put the filings online so that everyone can view them in a central location, and I think that's a really good development. So everyone can, whether you're a planner, or builder, or whoever, you can see what the requirements are in each city for energy as well as building standards tiers. Next. And then here's some resources we have on our website, buildgreennow.org. Got some policy toolkits, model findings, cost effectiveness, and then the CalGreen Companion Guide, which is going to be released soon. There's the BACC's website. And I didn't mention it, but the AIA California Council, the American Institute of Architects, their local chapter, put together a comparison checklist between LEED and Greenpoint rated and CalGreen, and that's useful to see kind of at a glance how the rating systems and the tiers and the mandatory portions of CalGreen stack up. So those are all available right now. Next. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Wes. So I'm not seeing any questions right now, so if folks have anything they want to ask Wes or our other two speakers, please go ahead and get those to me now at this point. Okay, I see a question. I've seen quite a few questions asking whether the slides will be available for download, and yes, all three presentations are currently available on our website, and I'll go ahead and get that link up there again for everybody. Maybe Tony, you can throw that on there. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks to all of our speakers for sharing with us today, and thanks to everyone who tuned in to this webinar. I hope you found it useful. Please take a few minutes to fill out the survey. When you close out, you will be prompted to do so. We'll be asking questions that relate to how useful you found this webinar, but also we want to know about topics for future webinars. We'll be doing 6 next year and 6 the following year. So if you have any topics that you'd like to see addressed, let us know and we'll try and get that done. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thanks everybody for joining us.